why does God do that? Why does God put an end to the judgment before it reaches its fullness? That's an important question in this story. Now you might look at verse 17 and you might say, well, God heard David's cry and decided that in response to David saying, punish me instead, God decided not to punish Israel. The problem with that is that actually David never is punished. So it doesn't seem like that really works. It doesn't seem that that theory works. I don't think God stopped because he decided to punish David instead. Then you might say, well, maybe God ended the judgment early because David offered a sacrifice, which he does there in verses 24 and 25. But I don't think that's it either, and I'll tell you why. That sacrifice comes later. God has already stopped the judgment, and then he does require the sacrifice, but God had already made up his mind to stop the judgment early, so to speak. So why does God stop the judgment against David and against Israel? That's a key question in this story. For that matter, why does God withhold judgment from you and from me? When God could look through our whole lives, and he could look through those moments when we are faced with temptation as David was, and when we don't turn to him, and when we don't resist, and we give in to sin. When God looks at our lives and he sees pride and selfishness, he sees the words that we speak that hurt another person, he sees thoughts that put ourselves at the center, why does God withhold judgment from us? Why does he not go forth and carry out justice that we deserve? Now, some people look at this question and they say, well, you're looking at an Old Testament story, and the God of the Old Testament was kind of a curmudgeon-y, angry, vengeful kind of God. And New Testament God is much nicer. He goes easier on sin. That doesn't sound right, though, does it? I mean, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, so it can't be that. Is God just forgive and just sort of look at our sins and say, well, that's okay, let's just leave that alone, let's just forgive? No, we know that that's not it either, because forgiveness always has to come at a cost to someone. So why does God withhold the judgment from us? Well, here's where the last paragraphs of the story are so important, and this is why I think the narrator or the author of 2 Samuel places this story at the end of the book. We were an Israelite reading this for the first time. These names, that the threshing floor that David purchases, we would know right where those were, because these places actually had significance in the life of Israel. And we would think of at least two things when we read this story. The first, our minds would go back a few hundred years. Because as it turns out, this threshing floor just outside of, or just in Jerusalem on the mountaintop where Jerusalem was built, was the same place where Abraham took up his son Isaac onto the mountain, onto Mount Moriah. It's the same place where Abraham put his son on that altar. And it's the same place where Abraham raised his knife above his head and was prepared to bring that knife down, just as the angel was prepared to bring judgment against Jerusalem. And it's the same place where God himself intervened again and said, stop. Don't bring forth that justice, that judgment. That's the same place here. And it's the same place. That's the first thing we would think of. The second thing we would think of, at least we can with the benefit of where we stand on the other side of the cross, this is the same place where the Israelites would build the temple. And it's the same place where for centuries the people would bring their offerings. They would bring their sheep and their goats and their bulls and their wheat and their grain, and they would put it on that altar, and they would know that God had turned aside his anger from their sin. And they would hear the pardon of God pronounced upon them by the priest. And in the fullness of time, this is the same place where God's own Son was brought and put up on the cross. And where Jesus himself would be put and hung up there, experiencing the fullness of God's judgment. Only this time there would be no one to speak out and say, stop. And the full weight of God's justice would fall upon Jesus. And the full weight of God's justice would be carried out upon God's Son. Jesus would be the one to bear the weight of David's sin, of your sin, and my sin. But because God brought that judgment upon Jesus, He will never bring it upon us. He will never bring it upon us. It's been carried out in full. The judgment has been drained. The cup of God's wrath has been drained empty. This story is meant to conclude. It's meant to give us one final look at the life of King David. We've been looking at David, I think, about a year and a half, as I said.